In video 3 for Unit 9, we're going to be looking at some of the social and political issues of the 1960s. The Civil Rights Movement was one of the most prominent parts of the early 1960s. This movement was spurred on by things like Jackie Robinson breaking the color barrier in baseball, President Truman's integration of the military, the Montgomery bus boycott, and the Brown versus Board of Education case of the 1950s. Several groups formed to push for civil rights, and there are some groups already in existence, like the NAACP that we talked about earlier. The most famous group was the Southern Christian Leadership Conference led by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. His group included people of all different races, and their focus was to use nonviolent civil disobedience to try to bring people's attention to the issues that were happening to certain groups in America. They would do things like large marches and rallies to, again, bring attention to the discrimination and racism that was happening. Other groups like the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee also started as nonviolent organizations. They would do things like sit ins. This picture is a sit in where students of different races would go in together to a place that only served whites and order food. And in this picture here, you see them being attacked by people pouring their drinks over their heads, salt shakers, mustard, ketchup, spitting at them, cussing at them, and a couple of these students even had cigarettes put out on the back of their neck. Um, and so these were a lot more confrontational tactics than what Martin Luther King Jr. would use. Eventually, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, some of the members became frustrated at the slow pace of change and dropped their nonviolent part of their name and actually started using more militant action. However, Martin Luther King Jr.'s group continued to remain nonviolent throughout the civil rights era. What were some of the tactics used by various civil rights groups, and what was the main philosophy that Martin Luther King Jr. followed? Now, television had a huge impact on the civil rights movement. There's just something about seeing things with your own eyes that changes your perspective about things. A lot of people in America had heard stories about racism and segregation in certain parts of the country. But unless you lived in those areas, you just didn't really know how bad it really was. One of the key events that changed a lot of Americans' opinions about the civil rights movement is when they saw television coverage, news coverage of the Children's March in Birmingham, Alabama. On video, students were being attacked by police dogs, being knocked over in the streets with high pressure fire hoses. And for a lot of Americans, this was shocking to see the way that people are being treated, and not just people, but children being treated in Birmingham, Alabama. Martin Luther King Jr. is also going to be able to go on national television and give his I Have a Dream speech, which is his appeal to the nation about why changes needed to be made. So, television has a huge impact on changing the nation's perception about civil rights. How did television impact the civil rights movement? Martin Luther King Jr. was arrested while in Birmingham, Alabama at one of his protests. And while he was in jail, some religious leaders from Birmingham wrote a letter asking King to back off. They were concerned about the tension that he was causing. Now, remember, Martin Luther King Jr.'s group was nonviolent, but these people were afraid that things might happen if they didn't stop. Well, as he's sitting in jail thinking about this, he pens his own letter called The Letter from the Birmingham Jail. And in this, he basically said that, blacks have been waiting for centuries for their rights. And if they didn't push for them, nothing would ever change. And so this was a key letter in encouraging people already involved in the civil rights movement to continue pushing forward because if they didn't, they would never get their rights. It also brought a lot of more support to the civil rights movement by people who agreed with what he said. He later on gives his very famous I Have a Dream speech while in Washington at the famous March on Washington in August of 1963. This is a quote from his I Have a Dream speech. He says, "I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed." Now, creed is like a motto or a purpose statement. And he says that the national creed for America is that we hold these truths to be self evident, that all men are created equal. Of course, that's from the Declaration of Independence. And so he's reminding Americans about what we believe. We say that Americans believe that everybody is equal. And his question to the country was simply this: is that true for everybody? Is everybody being treated equal? And a lot of people listening to that speech would have had to agree with Martin Luther King Jr. and said, you know what? We aren't truly living out our creed. Explain how the following impacted the civil rights movement: the letter from the Birmingham jail and the I Have a Dream speech. Now, a couple other movements that happened in the 60s involved migrant farm workers and women. For migrant farm workers, these are people who would go from farm to farm helping do different tasks like harvesting crops. And a lot of them were being mistreated, paid very little. A lot of them worked in bad conditions. Some of them worked in places where they didn't even have a restroom or even a porta potty to use for the entire day while they're working. Cesar Chavez followed the example of people like Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr. and used nonviolent protests to try to bring attention to the plight of these farm workers. For example, he organized a large grape boycott on table grapes from California, and it forced these large farms to start listening to the demands of these workers. Eventually, these farm workers were able to create their own union called the United Farm Workers, which allowed them to more effectively ask for benefits, better working conditions, and better pay. What were some of the goals of the United Farm Workers? And how did Cesar Chavez's tactics, or how were they similar to the tactics used by Martin Luther King Jr.? Other groups pushed for women's rights in the 1960s and 70s. Now, the women's rights movement dates all the way back to the period right after the Second Great Awakening with the Seneca Falls movement, where women first started asking for the right to vote. During the Progressive Era, women continue to ask for the right to vote, and they finally get that with the 19th Amendment. So in the 1960s and 70s, women can vote, so what are groups like now pushing for? Well, they're asking for women to be treated equally. Some of the things that women push for involved access to abortion, childcare services, but a big focus of it had to do with equal opportunity, ending sexual discrimination in jobs and pay. A lot of women were not being given equal opportunity in jobs. Also, it was very common for women to get paid less than a man for doing the exact same job just because she was a woman. So now, and groups like this were pushing to try to put an end to those unfair practices. What were some of the major goals of now? Now, one of the greatest tragedies in American history also happened in the early 60s when President Kennedy was assassinated on November 22nd, 1963, while in Dallas, Texas. Now, this assassination shocked the nation, but it also showed how strong we were because even through this great crisis, we came through this as a very strong, united nation. It also helped Kennedy in a strange way. His assassination helped the country move through and push through a lot of the things that he wanted. Lyndon Johnson was able to use the goodwill created after Kennedy's assassination to push through a lot of the things that Kennedy wanted through to push those things through Congress. For example, Kennedy was sympathetic to the civil rights movement. So after his assassination, the new president, Lyndon Johnson, was able to push through the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So in a strange way, Kennedy's assassination actually helped things like the civil rights movement and other causes that Kennedy wanted. So how did the JFK assassination impact the civil rights movement? Now, the Civil Rights Act was part of a large group of programs pushed through Congress by President Johnson called the Great Society. He also called this, the other nickname he gave this was his War on Poverty. The Great Society programs were supposed to help pull Americans out of poverty. A lot of Americans still lived in poverty in the 1950s and 60s, even though the economy had been going well for most Americans. We're going to look at some of the key parts of the Great Society and his War on Poverty in just a moment. The first is the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So, this is part of the Great Society, and it finally banned discrimination in America based on race. But they didn't just stop there when Congress made this law. They also banned discrimination on things like religion, national origin, gender, and other issues. So, this law finally put an end to things like whites only restaurants or black and white water fountains and other types of discrimination that had been going on since before the Civil War in America. There also were a lot of places that were doing things like literacy tests. These were tests that you had to take to vote, and they were always done in a way where the certain groups were not allowed to vote. Most people would fail the literacy test, and so it was kind of like a gate that they used to keep certain people out from voting. If they didn't want you to vote, they say, "Here, you got to take this test. You failed it. Oh, you can't vote." So in 1965, as part of the Great Society, the Voting Rights Act bans literacy tests. You can't make people take a test to vote anymore. It also gave the federal government the power to go into certain places that were discriminating against certain races when it came to registering people to vote, and it allowed the government to go in to make sure that everybody had equal opportunity to vote. Medicare and Medicaid were part of the Great Society to deal with issues with health care. For older people, we already had the Social Security Act to give them a small pension, but health insurance for older people is very expensive. So Medicare helps provide health insurance to people over the age of 65. Medicaid helps provide health insurance for people who come for children who come from a low income home so that they have medical coverage. You also had things like Head Start, which was a preschool program designed to help children in areas with high poverty rates by allowing them to go to preschool to get a head start on their education so that they had the same opportunities as students from other parts of the country. What was the other nickname that Lyndon Johnson used to describe the Great Society programs? And then describe the purpose of these following programs that were part of the Great Society: the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and Medicare and Medicaid. Now, the year 1968 in America was just a crazy turbulent year, and we're going to go through some of the key events of the year 1968. It started in January and February with what's called the Tet Offensive. The Tet Offensive was a series of attacks pulled off by North Vietnam and the Viet Cong in South Vietnam. The Viet Cong was the group in South Vietnam that was being supported by North Vietnam, trying to help turn South Vietnam to communism. These attacks happened over a period of several weeks. The thing about these attacks that really shocked America was that Americans had been led to believe by the military and the government that things were going good in Vietnam and we were winning the war and the North Vietnamese had been weakened. And that all may have been true, but it led the American people to believe that, hey, maybe this war is going to end soon. The reality of the Tet Offensive was that it showed Americans that this war was far from over, that even though the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong may have been weakened, that they weren't close to giving up. And it made Americans start questioning, can we win this war? The Tet Offensive is oftentimes called the turning point because it did make a lot of Americans question whether or not we should be in Vietnam, whether or not we could win. And for those people that were against the war, it helped to spark the anti war protests that really became a big deal throughout the late 60s and early 70s. There's also a couple high-profile assassinations in 1968. On April 4th, Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. A shocking event because he was such a prominent leader, but he was targeted by a white man in a racially motivated assassination, which set off racial riots across over 100 cities in America. Later on, just a couple months later, Robert Kennedy was assassinated. At the time, Kennedy was the front runner for the Democratic nomination for president. He was running for president in 1968. And so his assassination was shocking, number one, because a high profile political candidate being assassinated is shocking no matter who it is. But number two, the fact that he was JFK's brother just reopened all those wounds of the JFK assassination from 5 years earlier. Now, the chaos of the election in 1968, especially around the Democrats, went all year long. In March, President Johnson um, decided to not run for president again, even though he could have run for 4 more years. This was largely due to the pressure that was being put on him because of the Vietnam War, the Tet Offensive, and the fact that things had not been going well in Vietnam. So the Democrats start scrambling for somebody to replace Johnson on the ticket. And it looks like Robert Kennedy is going to be that person for the Democrats, and then he's assassinated. So in August, the Democrats meet in Chicago at their big national convention. Normally, this would have been a celebration to crown their nominee, but they don't have one. So they have to decide at this meeting who's going to be their nominee for president. And while they're doing this out in the streets, there's chaos happening. Anti war protesters by the hundreds had shown up at the Democratic National Convention to protest the Vietnam War, and they got in fights and riots happen on the streets of Chicago. Police are fighting anti-war protesters, and Americans are all watching this on their television sets. And it shocked Americans to see this type of behavior happening at a national convention like the Democratic National Convention. It made some Americans wonder if our country was in trouble and if we could handle these kind of protests. Now, as it turns out, we were okay, but it was just a shocking, crazy year, 1968. Briefly explaining the impact of these following events from 1968: the Tet Offensive, the Martin Luther King assassination, the Robert Kennedy assassination, and the election chaos.